142, Gibbet. I said gibbet in the previous chapters. I always pronounce that word wrong, but it's gibbet, Gibbet. A fortnight had passed since the incidents just related. It was a Monday morning. The clock of St. Giles had just struck 6 when the faint flickering gleam of a candle struggled through the uppermost windows of the hangman's house. The first persons who were passing along at that hour and on the dark winter's morning shuddered as they caught a glimpse of the sickly glare through the obscurity in the midst, for they thought within themselves, the executioner is up early on account of the man that's to be hanged at 8 o'clock. And such was indeed the case. Smithers rose shortly before 6, and having lighted the solitary candle that stood upon the mantel, proceeded to the floor below to call his son. "Gibbet, you lazy hound," he cried, thundering with his fists at the door of the child's room. "Get up." "I'm getting up, father," replied the lad from the interior of the chamber. "Well, make haste about it," said the executioner in a harsh tone. He then returned to the loft. There was something horribly fantastic in the appearance of that place. The dim and sickly light of the candle did but little more than redeem from a complete obscurity the various strange objects which we have already described. But as the penetrating eye of the executioner plunged into the visible darkness of the loft and beheld the ominous figure balancing beneath the beam, while its mask of a livid white hue wore a ghastly appearance in contrast with the black body and limbs which it surmounted, no sentiment of horror nor of alarm agitated his heart. The avocations of the man had brutalized him, and blunted every humane feeling which he had once possessed. He walked up and down the room impatiently for several minutes until the door opened and his son entered. The hideous countenance of the lad was ghastly pale and distorted with horror. His eyes glared fearfully as if terrific apparitions flitted before them. "Gibbet," said his father, "you shall try your hand this morning on a living being instead of a puppet." "This morning," repeated the lad, his teeth chattering and his knees knocking together. "To be sure, didn't I tell you so last night?" cried the executioner. "Why, you scoundrel, you ought to have prayed that no reprieve might be sent for the chap that's to be tucked up this morning, instead of working yourself up to this state of cowardly nervousness. But I'll take it out of you, I will." With these words, Smithers seized his leathern thong and was advancing towards the boy, when the wretched lad threw himself on his knees, clasped his hands together, and cried, "No, father, don't. I can't bear the lash. You don't know how it hurts. I'll do all you tell me." "Well, that's speaking proper, that is," said the executioner, dropping the already uplifted thong. "It's all for your good that I use it now and then, Gibbet. Don't I want to make a man out of you? Look at the money you can earn if you'll only make yourself a name like me. Do you think the sheriffs throughout England would all apply to me to do their work for them if I wasn't celebrated for my skill? Why, even the criminals themselves must look upon it as a regular blessing to have such a knowing hand as me to tie their last cravat for them. I'd bet £1 that the man who's to be turned off presently isn't half as miserable as people think, 'cause, why, he's well aware that I shan't put him to no pain. I know you've got a great name in your business, father. We call it profession in future, Gibbet. It's more genteel. And after all, it's as good as a barrister's, for the barrister gets the man hanged, and I hang him. That's all the difference." "I know it's very respectable, father," resumed the lad submissively, "but still, Still what?" cried Smithers, taking up the thong again. Nothing, father," faltered Gibbet. "So much the better. Now come to the model and take and pinion the figure, 'cause that's what I mean you to do presently down at Newgate. Begin by degrees, as the saying is. You shall pinion this man today. You shall let the drop fall for the next, and you shall put the halter on the one that comes after him, whoever he may be." "Must I pinion the man this morning, father?" inquired the lad, the workings of whose countenance were now absolutely terrific. "Must you? Of course you must," answered Smithers. "Why, what the devil are you snivelling at now? I'd wager a crown to a brass farthing that there's many a young nobleman who'd give £50 to be able to do it. Look how they hire the winders opposite Newgate. It does me good to think that the aristocracy and gentry patronizes hangings as well as other fine arts. Why, what would become of the executioners if they didn't? Why, the legislature would abolish capital punishment at once." Gibbet clasped his hands together and raised his eyes in an imploring manner, as much as to say, "Oh, how I wish they would." Fortunately for him, his father did not perceive this expression of emotion, for the executioner had approached the candle to the model Gallows, and was now busily occupied in arranging the figure for his son's practice. "I'll tell you who are the patrons of my profession, continued the executioner, and if you had a grain of feeling for your father, you'd go down on your knees night and morning and pray for them. The old Tories and the clergy are my friends. I'm a staunch Tory, too. I hate changes. And what changes have done? swept away the good old laws that used to hang a man for stealing anything above 40 shillings. George the Third was the best king we ever had. He used to tuck 'em up 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 at once. Folks may well talk of the good old times when an executioner could make his 20 or 30 guineas in a morning. I'd sooner take 2 guineas for each man under such an excellent system than have the 10 pounds as I do now. While Smithers was thus talking, he had lowered the figure until it stood upon the drop. He then took off the halter, but the puppet still retained its upright position because it was well stiffened and had heavy plates of lead fastened to the soles of its feet. Now what a cry the rascally radical Sunday papers make against the people they call the saints, continued Smithers as he unfastened the cord which pinioned the arms of the puppet. And yet those very saints are the ones that are most in favor of the punishment of death. For my part, I adore the saints, I do. When Fitzmaurice Shelley brought forward his measures to do away with capital penalty, didn't Dinglas and Cherrytree and all those pious men make a stand against him? And don't they know what's right and proper? Of course they do. I never read so much of the House of Commons business before as I did then, but I was in a precious fright, it's true. I thought of calling a public meeting of all the executioners in the kingdom to petition Parliament against the measure, but I didn't do it, because the House of Commons might have thought that we was interested. Smithers paused for a moment and contemplated the puppet and the model gallows with great admiration. He had fashioned the one and built the latter himself, and he was not a little proud of his handiwork. "Now come, Gibbet," he at length exclaimed. "Come and try your hand at this work for a few minutes before breakfast, and then we'll go down yonder together." Gibbet approached the model gallows, but his countenance still denoted the most profoundly rooted disgust and abhorrence. "Let's suppose that the culprit is as yet in his own cell, Gibbet," continued the executioner. "Well, it's time to pinion him, we'll say. There's the sheriff standing there, and here's the chaplain. Now you go forward and begin." Gibbet took the whipcord which his father handed to him. "That's right, now you won't bounce up to the poor devil just like a wild elephant. Remember that he's more or less in an interesting situation, as the ladies say. You'll rather glide behind him and insinuate the cord between his arms, whispering at the same time, 'Beg pardon.' Mind, and don't forget that, because we're under an obligation to him to some extent, as he's the means of putting money in our pocket and we get the reversion of his clothes." Here Gibbet cast a hasty but terrified glance toward his father's attire. "I know what you're looking at, youngster," said Smithers with a coarse laugh. "You want to see if I've got on my usual toggery? To be sure I have. I wear it as a compliment to the gentleman that we're to operate on this morning. This coat was the one that Pegsworth cut his last fling in, this waistcoat was Greenacre's, and these breeches were William Lees's. But go on, we mustn't waste time in this way." Gibbet approached the puppet and endeavored to manipulate the string as his father had instructed him, but his hand trembled so convulsively that he could not even pass it between the arms of the figure. While he was still fumbling with the cord and vainly endeavoring to master his emotions, the leathern thong descended with tremendous violence upon his back. An appalling cry burst from the poor lad, but the executioner only showered down curses on his head. At length Gibbet contrived, through fear of another blow, to pinion the figure in a manner satisfactory to his brutal parent. "There," exclaimed Smithers, "I shall make something of you at last. What virtue there must be in an old bit of leather. Seems to put the right spirit into you, at all events. Well, that's all you shall do this morning down at Newgate. And mind and do it as if the thong was hanging over your head, or it will be all the worse for you when we get home. Try and keep up the credit of your father's name, and show the sheriffs and the chaplain how you can trust their pigeon for him. They always take great notice, they do. Last time there was an executioner, the chaplain says to me, says he, 'Smithers, I don't think you had your hand nicely in this morning.' 'Don't you, sir?' says I. 'No,' says he, 'I've seen you do it more genteel than that.' 'Well, sir,' says I, 'I'll do my best to please you next time.' 'Ah, do, there's a good fellow, Smithers,' says the chaplain, and off he goes to breakfast with the sheriffs and governor, a smacking his lips at the idea of the cold fowl and ham that he meant to pinch into. Well, I only mention that anecdote to show you how close the authorities take notice, that's all. So mind and do your best, boy." "Yes, father," returned Gibbet. "So now we've done the pinioning," continued Smithers, once more busying himself with the puppet, which he surveyed with an admiration almost amounting to a kind of love. "Well, we can suppose that our chap has marched from the cell and has just got on the scaffold. So far, so good. We can't do better than polish him off decently now that he is here," proceeded Smithers, alluding to the figure, and rather musing aloud than addressing himself to his son. "Now all we've got to do is to imagine that the bells are ringing. There stands the parson reading the funeral service. Here I am, take the halter, that's already tied nicely around the poor devil's neck, fix the loop on this hook that hangs down from the beam of the gibbet, then I leave the scaffold, I go underneath, I pull the bolt, and down he falls." "Oh," cried Gibbet, literally writhing with mental agony, as the drop fell with a crashing sound and the jerking noise of the halter met his ear moments afterward. "Now then, coward," exclaimed the executioner, and again the leathern thong elicited horrible screams from the boy. The lad was still crying, and his father was in the midst of sundry fearful anathemas leveled against what he called his son's cowardice, when a knock was heard at the door of the loft. "Come in," shouted the executioner. The invitation was obeyed, and an elderly man dressed in a shabby suit of black entered the room with an affected solemnity of gait. That's it. Okay, that's the end of the chapter. So we don't know who it is that's just arrived. We don't know if Gibbet is going to actually have to go help his dad with the execution or not. We'll see what happens.